The radio crackled with static as the colonel's voice cut through the tension. "Stand down and hand over the intel, Captain. That's a direct order." Lieutenant Mara Voss steadied herself, the hum of her rifle against her shoulder grounding her in the cramped darkness. Around her, the squad exchanged uneasy glances. The mission specs didn't add up. The coordinates pointed straight into uncertainty. Mara's mind ran through the risk. Disobeying could mean losing everything she'd built, but following orders might cost lives. She took a breath, her voice steady. "Negative, sir. I cannot comply." The weight of her decision settled in, as the squad waited, silent, for what would come next. Orders in a combat zone are supposed to be clear, precise, and above all, trustworthy. But this one felt engineered to fail. The encrypted drive in Mara's hand wasn't just a piece of hardware. It contained intelligence so sensitive that its compromise would put the entire unit at risk. Protocol dictated strict protection of materials like this, never a live handoff in hostile territory, and never without multiple layers of authentication. Yet, here she was, staring at coordinates that pointed her squad toward a dry riverbed she knew too well. The terrain offered no cover, and the satellite images were suspiciously Kleno movement, no heat signatures, nothing but the kind of emptiness that suggested a trap rather than safety. Her sergeant quietly mouthed the numbers again, as if repeating them might make sense of the situation. But Mara's gut said otherwise. The lack of secondary authentication codes, the absence of a proper dead drop, and the direct order from a colonel who rarely left his post behind a desk call of it stacked up wrong. Private Teves shifted beside her, his silent tension matching the unease that settled over the group. They'd all trained for this: verify, confirm, and act only when the chain of command held up to scrutiny. Tonight, that chain felt dangerously thin. The colonel's next transmission arrived with a layer of static, the words clipped and urgent. "Package Alpha must reach staging by 0930 local." The timeline was off. Their extraction wouldn't arrive for another 23 minutes, according to the last secure update. Standard operating procedure demanded that anything this critical move through encrypted channels and dead drops, not exposed in the open. Mara tapped her wrist display, pulling up the original mission brief. The cryptographic watermark, normally flawless, showed subtle distortions, the kind flagged in training as evidence of tampering. She caught Sergeant Rhea's eye, and the small shake of his head told her he'd seen it too. A soft chime from the encrypted drive broke the silence. Someone was attempting remote access from an unrecognized terminal, a technical impossibility without the proper biometric clearance. Major Shin, the only authorized user, had been evacuated days ago. The colonel's voice returned, sharper, almost mechanical. "Compliance noted, Lieutenant." Moved to extraction grid. But Mara hadn't complied, and whoever was watching only saw the drive's automated handshake, not her refusal. The final message before the channel died carried a strange rhythm, faint, repetitive click embedded beneath the static. Mara recognized the cadence from a previous exercise, a trick used in signal spoofing. It was the last confirmation she needed. She glanced at the countdown on her HUD. 16 minutes left. Every choice from here would count, and the squad's next move would test not just their training, but the trust that held them together. Mara's hand hovered over her sidearm, not to draw it, but to signal. In the military, orders are meant to be followed without hesitation, but there are moments when the line between duty and conscience blurs. Mara felt it in the silence that settled after the static. She caught Rhea's eye, and he gave the slightest nod, confirmation that she wasn't alone in her doubt. For a moment, the squad seemed suspended between two worlds: the rigid certainty of command and the uncertain terrain of their own judgment. The static on her comms shifted, not fading, but reshaping itself. A burst of Morse code, unmistakable in its rhythms, cut through the noise. Mara's pulse ticked up, each beat loud in her ears. This wasn't just interference. It was a distress signal buried in the jamming, coming from their own systems. She realized then that they weren't just being blocked from command, they were being deliberately misled. The colonel's last message had felt off, too, the faint hum in the background out of place for their solar-powered command post. Mara's mind raced, weighing the consequences. Obeying could send her team straight into a trap, but defying the chain of command would mark her as insubordinate, maybe even a traitor. Corporal Lynn worked her tablet in silence, hands moving quick and sure. She flashed the authentication logs for Mara to see every transmission after the initial order carried valid encryption but mismatched timestamps. Someone had copied their crypto keys, but the clock was wrong. It was a detail only a trained eye would catch, and Mara's stomach tightened at the implication. This wasn't a simple technical glitch. It was a coordinated attempt to manipulate them. A voice, unfamiliar and accented, broke through the static, for a heartbeat then vanished. Mara glanced at her squad, seeing the tension in their stances, the way Teva's jaw clenched and Lynn's shoulders drew tight. The squad wasn't asking for answers out loud, but she knew they were looking to her to make the call. The destruct sequence on the drive was her answer. As the screen flashed a warning in Cyrillic script, Reyes exhaled sharply. They all recognized the font Russian firmware, not standard issue. The realization settled over Mara, heavier than any order. The enemy wasn't just outside the wire, they were inside the systems, speaking with familiar voices and issuing false commands. The radios crackled again, all at once. The colonel's voice, this time too perfect, echoed through each handset in unison. Abort destruct sequence immediately. The unnatural synchronization left no doubt whatever was on the other end was no longer their command. Mara's heart hammered as she watched the drive's light fade, the last trace of data gone. The static cleared, and the colonel's real voice, strained and distant, tried to break through but was cut off mid-sentence. The squad stood ready, weapons trained outward, waiting for whatever came next. In that moment, Mara understood the true cost of conscience, the willingness to risk everything on a decision that might never be vindicated. A faint vibration in the ground signaled a new threat approaching, drawing every eye to the horizon. Two black hawks appeared on Mara's thermal scope. Their approach from the northwest, several minutes ahead of schedule. The timing was wrong, and the angle didn't match the extraction plan. She watched as they closed in, formation tight, transponders broadcasting friendly codes. For a moment, everything looked official. But then her HUD flagged an anomaly. The identification signal repeated at precise intervals, no randomization, no drift. SOCOM protocols required a variable pulse. This was too regular, too perfect. Reyes caught it as well. He rerouted their IFF to a backup channel, and as the system cycled, the lead helicopter's thermal signature flickered just a split second, but enough to catch a mismatch in the exhaust pattern. The overlay tried to correct, but Mara saw what was underneath. The outline didn't match a Black Hawk. It was close, but not quite right. The enemy had used thermal signature spoofing, masking a foreign bird as one of their own. Mara's pulse thudded in her throat. This wasn't a rescue, it was a trap, Teves whispered. Markings check out. But under magnification, Mara noticed faint Cyrillic traces beneath the fresh paint. Just enough to unsettle her, not enough to convince anyone who hadn't been watching for it. She felt the squad's tension shift, everyone waiting for her call. The comms crackled again, the colonel's voice flat, too clipped, ordering them to stand by for pickup. It sounded right, but only on the surface. Mara gave Lynn a nod. The missile launcher came up, and the first shot left the tube with a sharp recoil that scattered grit across their boots. The missile struck the lead helicopter. No countermeasures, no evasive maneuvering. The bird went down hard, flames licking up through the rotor. The second helicopter veered, its disguise slipping for just a moment as the thermal overlay glitched, revealing the wrong silhouette. A cold wave of relief and shock swept through Mara. She had made the right call, but the cost of hesitation could have been fatal. The radio crackled with a new voice this time, the real extraction pilot. Her tone was casual, familiar, and the call came from far southwest, nowhere near the supposed landing zone. The confirmation was undeniable. The enemy had nearly fooled them, using their own protocols, their own habits, against them. Smoke from the wreckage drifted across the ridge, mixing with the morning haze. Mara crouched, the ruined encrypted drive still warm in her hand. The squad gathered in silence, each of them absorbing the reality of what almost happened. The standoff had ended, but the consequences were only just beginning to settle over them. Mara pressed her thumb to the drive's keypad, the destruct sequence waiting for her final command. Defiance in uniform is never clean. For Mara, the cost arrived in the hush that followed her decision. She triggered the emergency wipe sequence with 3 layered authorizations, the drive responding with a sharp whine as its memory burned out. The squad stood silent, every eye on her, the moment stretching between what they'd just survived and what waited for them on the other side of the radio. The colonel's voice returned, brittle and close to breaking. "Stand down, Lieutenant. That's an asset belonging to Central Command." Static bled through, but the threat was clear. Mara didn't answer. She entered the final code. The drive's light faded, its contents unrecoverable. The colonel's last words, "You're finished," hung in the air, flat and certain. No one spoke. Mara's record, the years spent following orders, the commendations, all of it felt distant now. Her mind caught on the realization that she'd just destroyed the one thing command had demanded, and there was no going back. A sudden explosion rolled through the valley, the tremor lifting dust around their boots. The fireball bloomed in the distance, right where their original extraction point lay. The timing was exact. Mara stared at the blast site, a cold shock running through her. The colonel had sent them into a kill box, and she'd almost walked her squad straight into it. She felt the weight of that knowledge settle on her chest, anger, disbelief, and a sharp, silent gratitude that she'd trusted her instincts. Reyes checked the schematics on his tablet, his voice low. Precision, guided strike, not random. The impact pattern was too clean. Whoever had fed them those coordinates had known exactly when and where to strike. Mara's HUD pinged with a new message from command. The text scrolled across her display. Return to base immediately. Debrief pending. The timestamp was wrong, sent before the missile hit. Lynn's diagnostics confirmed it had bounced through too many relays, the routing more elaborate than any standard protocol. Smoke drifted toward them, carrying the bitter smell of burning electronics and scorched earth. Teves spoke, his voice raw. They set us up. No one disagreed. The falsified codes, the spoofed helicopters, the precision strike, every detail pointed to betrayal from within. Mara ejected the drive's charred core, the casing cold in her hand. The asset was gone, and the colonel would have nothing to show for it. Another message arrived, terse and insistent. Acknowledge receipt of orders. Mara looked at her squad. Reyes stood ready, sidearm loose in his grip. Lynn kept her eyes on the comm logs, searching for more signs of tampering. Tev stared at the blast site, jaw tight. Mara tapped her mic twice, the squad's signal for weapons ready and movement imminent. She typed her reply to command. Orders acknowledged. Returning with full squad. Those words wouldn't shield her from the investigation that waited. They wouldn't erase the consequences of her decision. But they were the truth, and they were enough to get her team moving. They charted a new route, verifying every coordinate 3 times before taking a step. The ruined landing zone faded behind them, smoke rising into a sky that offered no answers. As they walked, Mara kept her eyes forward, knowing the real test would come not on the battlefield, but in the rooms where judgment waited. Silent and cold. Inside the debriefing room, the air felt close and institutional, thick with the scent of old coffee and disinfectant. Across from Mara, 3 officers watched her with the same measured blankness. Officers peppered her with procedural questions, ignoring the real villain, her rogue colonel. She kept her answers clipped, reciting policy and regulation numbers, never volunteering more than required. The major at the end of the table scribbled in his notepad, never once meeting her eyes. Outside, the silence that followed was sharper than any official rebuke. In the mess hall, conversations died the moment Mara walked in. The cook, who once slipped her extra helpings, now measured each portion with exacting care. At a table nearby, a corporal she'd trained with busied himself with a stack of forms, never glancing her way. She ate alone, the absence of her usual squad mates impossible to ignore. Reyes, she heard, had been reassigned to overnight watch, though he'd just returned from the field. Lynn was moved to comms maintenance with no explanation. No one spoke to her directly, but the message circulated without words. 16 hours later, a silent escort led Mara through a series of windowless corridors to a conference room deep in the administrative wing. No insignia marked the heavy door. Inside, a general waited, sitting behind a steel table. He wore plain fatigues, elbows frayed, face unreadable. Without a word, he slid a manila envelope across the table. Mara opened it to find satellite images of the ruined landing zone, time-stamped long after the missile strike. The infrared scans showed figures moving through the wreckage search parties, the caption said, but the names and ranks were all wrong. Colonel Eric Vral and 2 aides, supposedly killed in Afghanistan, appeared alive and moving with purpose. The general's voice was steady, almost indifferent. That operation was never cleared. He tapped another photo, a surveillance shot, of a man in a colonel's uniform boarding a private jet in Odessa. The face was blurred, but the bearing was unmistakable. The jet's tail number matched a shell corporation, flagged in intelligence briefings. Mara waited, counting heartbeats before she spoke. How long? Her voice barely carried across the table. He opened a folder stamped with a black operation seal. The dossier inside was incomplete, whole years redacted, deployments listed only by country, awards missing signatures. The final page was a single line. Subject has maintained unauthorized contact with foreign nationals since 2019. No charges, no commendation, just another envelope, unsealed, with new orders for Mara transfer instructions, a set of coordinates, a reporting window in Greenwich Mean Time, nothing more. The general gathered the photos and closed the file. You don't speak of this. Not to your squad. Not in letters. His tone left no room for negotiation. As Mara left, she heard footsteps fading down the hall, someone listening, then disappearing before she could see who. Later, back in her quarters, she examined the orders. The paper felt wrong, thinner than standard, the watermark missing. Still, the authorization code passed the secure check. Her service record didn't update, only a blinking cursor where her new assignment should have appeared. At 2300, someone left a dossier on her bunk. Inside were records for each squad member who'd followed her lead, all flagged for sudden, opaque assignments. Arctic training for Reyes, embassy duty for Lynn and Taves. The colonel's name was absent, but the distribution list included offices with no clear function. Mara burned the documents in a barrel behind the motor pool, watching as hidden text curled into view along the scorched edges, coordinates linked to a black site in Lithuania, the last trace of the colonel's path before the records turned to fiction. But unseen forces were already writing her next orders. The general sat behind a battered desk, eyes fixed on a single photograph. Mara took the seat across from him, the chair scraping against the floor. On the table, the image showed 3 bodies in scorched combat gear, faces hidden by melted masks. One still clutched a radio. The names beneath were the same as those in her mission brief: veteran electronic and intel specialists, all supposedly lost in a distant ambush months ago. Their records had crossed Mara's desk before, always with the same sanitized explanations and tidy dates. Now, stripped of their cover, their roles in the plan became clear. The general slid a folder across the table. Inside were intercepted radio exchanges messages between the colonel and an unsecured satellite phone. The voices tense, the words coded but unmistakable. 3 assets require extraction after diversion failure. The date matched the day before Mara's squad deployed. The implication was simple. Those operatives weren't just casualties, they were waiting to collect the drive after Mara's team was eliminated. The plan had been in motion long before she received her orders. For Mara, each piece fit into a deadly puzzle she had just refused to complete. The false orders, the doctored records, the coordinated strike, all of it pointed to a network that had survived on silence and habit. She realized how close her squad had come to being written off, just another line in a report, while the real operation moved forward under false flags. The general's words were spare. Your squad's alive because you asked questions. 7 others weren't so lucky. He didn't linger on the details. He didn't need to. A single photograph of a downed medevac in Algeria, another squad lost after following coordinates from the same operations group, was enough. The pattern repeated. The same scarring, the same traces left behind, the same silence in the aftermath. He handed Mara a slip of paper. 13 names, analysts who'd flagged anomalies in the colonel's missions, all reassigned to distant posts over the past year. Mara memorized them, burning the paper later in a barrel behind the motor pool. The general said nothing else as she left the room. The files remained on the table, waiting for the next officer who might question the cost of following orders. In the hallway, the lights flickered overhead. Mara walked alone, the weight of what she'd uncovered settling over her. There would be no public acknowledgement, no medal, no official record of what she'd prevented. What waited for her next would not be shaped by ceremony, but by the quiet calculation of those who had watched her every move. After the operation, the base returned to its routines, but the atmosphere had shifted. The award ceremony took place in Hangar 7, fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting their cold glare across the assembled ranks. The general stood at the podium, reciting the official commendations. Teves, Lynn, and Reyes stepped forward in turn, each receiving a unit commendation ribbon recognition for adherence to protocol under extreme operational stress. The citations avoided any mention of the destroyed drive or the strike that nearly erased them. The words were careful, precise, and incomplete. Mara stood at the back, her uniform unchanged. The squad's glances told her what words could note an acknowledgement of what they'd survived, and of what could never be said aloud. When the last ribbon was pinned, the general's aide approached Mara and handed her a sealed manila envelope. No announcement, no explanation. She waited until the hangar had emptied before breaking the seal. Inside, her transfer orders listed a new assignment under Special Activities Division. The administrative code was unfamiliar. The reporting location, a set of coordinates, far from any known installation. The date was immediate. She folded the papers and tucked them away, her mind already moving ahead. That evening, Mara packed her gear in silence. No one came to inspect her locker or offer farewells. The barracks felt emptier than usual. At 2,300, a corporal delivered a set of new fatigue snow name tape. No insignia. The fabric was crisp, the pockets deeper than regulation. She found a surveillance device in the heel of her boot, another in her canteen. She left them untouched. A van arrived at dawn, unmarked and silent. The driver handed her a blindfold and a pair of headphones. She wore them without protest. The journey was unremarkable. The road smooth, the ride measured. When the van stopped, Mara stepped out in front of a windowless concrete building. The keycard she'd received buzzed the door open. Inside, a man in civilian clothes waited. He slid a folder across the desker. New identity, complete with a service record belonging to someone who had died years earlier. Memorize this, burn it when done. He spoke without looking up. He handed her an unregistered pistol, its serial number filed off. Welcome to the quiet war. Mara accepted the weapon, feeling its weight settle in her hand. She understood what this meant. There would be no medals, no public record, no official history. The only evidence of her actions would be the people who survived and those who did not. As she stepped through the next door, Mara made herself a promise. She would never bow to blind orders again. Some lessons, she thought, are meant to be carried forward, even when no one is watching. In the lecture hall, the silence pressed in a kind familiar to anyone who has ever waited for judgment. Mara set the declassified drive on the podium, its case battered, the evidence of its destruction still visible along the melted edge. She studied the rows of cadets, their faces young and expectant, each one measuring her for answers they might one day need. A first-year cadet asked, "Ma'am, was it worth it? The risk? The fallout?" Mara turned the drive in her hand, letting the question settle. What I destroyed wasn't just data. It was a decision point tone that could have cost my team everything. She didn't elaborate on the specifics. The room didn't need them. The lesson was never about the schematics or the numbers. It was about what you choose when the path splits, and the consequences that follow. The projector flickered with a redacted after-action report. Coordinates glowed on the screen, the blast radius unmistakable. The cadets took in the details, the match between the missile strike and her squad's original extraction point. The implication hung in the air orders, if followed without question, would have led them to their deaths. "You're taught to follow orders," Mara said, her voice steady. "But you're also taught to read the ground, to notice when the facts don't fit the narrative." She tapped the drive. "Sometimes the terrain isn't just what's outside the wire. It's the voices on your comms, the missing authentication, the silence where there should be confirmation." She paused, letting the idea settle. Chain of command matters, but so does the judgment you bring to it. A senior cadet challenged her. "With respect, ma'am, what happens when your judgment is wrong?" Mara met his gaze. "The weight of that choice never leaves you, but neither does the responsibility. Command expects obedience, but it also expects you to know when something's off. If you ignore that, you're not just risking your career, you're gambling with lives." She passed the empty shell of the drive down the row. Each cadet held it for a moment, the metal cool and scarred. Mara watched them, searching for signs that they understood the real lesson, that the hardest choices are often the ones no one will ever see, and the cost is paid in silence. At the end of the lecture, the department head lingered by the door. Mara packed her notes, leaving the drive shell on the podium. It would stay there, a quiet reminder for the next class. As the cadets filed out, one paused and asked, "How do you know when it's right to break the chain?" Mara didn't answer immediately. She let the question hang, its weight clear. The hallway outside was bright and busy, but Mara's mind stayed with the question. What would you do if your orders led your team to slaughter? Some answers never make it into the official record. Some reminders are left behind, waiting for the next person to wonder what it means to carry that choice. The encrypted drive was never found again, but in a secure archive, its scorched shell rests beside a silver starone for actions seen, the other for choices made in silence. The casing bears no inscription, only the marks left by its destruction. No ceremony recognizes moments like these. If you ever find yourself doubting an order, remember Lieutenant Voss and the cost of questioning what's handed down from above. Duty does not always belong to the insignia. Sometimes it's owed to those who trust you to see what others overlook. Have you faced a moment where your conscience clashed with the rules? Share your story below. In the hush between orders and action, true courage finds its voice.